My name is Robin Hassler Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of STAC. I also co-chair the Big Bend Coalition Against Human Trafficking. You should know that the Big Bend Coalition Against Human Trafficking, a co-sponsor of this event, is in the North Panhandle of the state of Florida. We are a coalition comprised of really kind of all the people, types of people that are on the chat now. Child welfare, agency folks, law enforcement, social services, community members, faith community, healthcare, really everybody, like many areas of our state and country, where we have a coalition to focus on the issue of sex and labor trafficking or human trafficking. So our coalition has taken on the role of being a sponsor and an organizer for this event every third Friday. So let me also tell you, and I'll be giving you some information about this later, but if you want to make sure you know about all of these events, I'll give you the link so you can sign up and get all that information. In the meantime, know that if you are in our area and you would like to be part of the Big Bend Coalition Against Human Trafficking, I welcome you to contact Kelly Doherty. You can see her name and number here in her email, and know that our next meeting will be on November 4. And many of you, it might be the same thing you're facing, but one of the issues that we are facing always is how do we make sure that the people in our community who might be trafficked, who might be at risk of being trafficked, or who are assisting people who are trafficked can get information about this organization, the Big Bend Coalition, as well as the services we provide. So that's our quest. Each meeting, we like to focus and think about how we can do our jobs better, really to build the trust to be able to assist and support survivors. A little bit about STAC. That's the agency that I had. I'm the executive director of STAC. I'm a lawyer by training and trade, but I've been doing policy work, I think, for the last 3 decades in this area, as well as in the area of violence against women. We founded STAC. I co-founded it with a small group here in Tallahassee 6 years ago. And we have really twin missions. One is to provide direct case management services to survivors of sex and labor trafficking, and also to assist those who are at severe risk of being trafficked. I also do a lot of work, as does our whole team, in doing these kinds of programs, educational programs, really those kinds of things that can help you, we hope and trust, wherever you sit and whatever you do in your personal life, in your professional life, as members of a faith community or other civic organizations, what you can do to help end trafficking in our world. We are in Tallahassee, which is a kind of urban area, suburban area, and we're also in the middle of a really big rural area. So we're doing our best to reach out also into those areas. As I mentioned, we also do lots of training. One of the things we do, and I want to leave you with, or not leave you with, we're just starting, give you the website for STAC, which is surviveandthriveadvocacy.org. That's where you're going to be able to see a recording of this program, and really every third Friday for the last year plus. We have those recordings thanks to USF. We have them up on our website. We also will share any key information that our presenters want us to on those links, and that's under our educational resources tab. Know there's a lot of other stuff there on our websites. We've got posters, we've got social media graphics you can use. Like, for example, you could say, oh, I just attended this. I'm just going to tell you, I know it's going to be a fabulous training today. And I'd like to share the information I learned with you all. And you can do that. And we've got tools to help you do that sharing on our website. Know too that everything we do is free of charge. We certainly appreciate all donations, because it's only because we can get funded to do this work that we can survive. So know that all of our services for survivors and our community outreach is free of charge. Here's an example of something that we produced with the CARES money we got from Leon County, Florida, which is really to have this kind of an outreach tool for people to see, who might be trafficked. And also, if you'll notice, even with those first 4 questions at the top of this, you'll see that we don't even mention the words trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking, because those 4 questions that might be useful for you to know and note down actually could be really the way you can start a conversation, or you could pick up on clues that someone might be trafficked. So that was intentional on our part, because really, as we'll learn more, it's rare that survivors identify as being trafficked, right? So this is one of the tools that we have on our website. So today we have a really wonderful array of speakers, and for anyone who has been working in this area or acquainted with human trafficking, you'll know how important the law is. And many of us have attended what we kind of casually call human trafficking 101 programs, which go into the ins and outs of the laws, that kind of give you a broad brush approach to understand some of the civil and criminal aspects of the law. But we thought today what we would do is go deeper on some really specific areas. And there's so much to cover. We're so grateful today to have experts from our community with us. First of all, I want to introduce Danica Harley and Melody Andrews from the FSU College of Law. And what I'm going to do for each of our presenters is do an intro of them. And then we'll get into our program and we'll follow through with our presentations in this order. So let me introduce you to Danica, who I met when you were a law student, but you are now a 2021 graduate from the Florida State University College of Law, my alma mater. I'll just let you all know that right now. Prior to attending law school, she graduated from the University of Central Arkansas with an MS in College Student Personnel Services and Administration from the University of Memphis with a BBA in economics. While at the College of Law, Ms. Harley was a student advocate within the FSU Public Interest Law Center Human Trafficking and Exploitation Law Project, or HELP, a clinical experience representing child survivors of trafficking in various legal capacities. Other clinical experiences include the Children's Advocacy Clinic and Gender and Family Justice Clinic. In 2020, Ms. Harley was recognized as the Clinical Legal Education Association Outstanding Clinical Student. This award was for excellence in clinical fieldwork and for exceptionally thoughtful, self-reflective participation in an accompanying clinical seminar nominated by clinical faculty at the FSU College of Law. Ms. Harley has received certification through the Professional Certification in Trauma and Resilience Level 1 offered through the FSU College of Social Work. And in the fall, we'll be joining the FSU, and that's kind of now, I think, now you have joined the FSU College of Law Public Interest Law Center as an instructor. Congratulations. And I'd like to ask you, Danica, we're going to do this with each of our speakers today. As you're doing this work on human trafficking, what was it that has drawn you to it, and what has kept you interested in this topic?
Absolutely. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much, Robin, for having me here today. I'm so excited to be here to have the opportunity to speak. I had my first experience and understanding of human trafficking from the sense of receiving training to help educate businesses about signs to look for and potential survivors of human trafficking, and things that restaurants, hotel owners should be aware of. It wasn't until I came to law school that I actually got to participate in direct advocacy for survivors. And that's when I realized how close to home that trafficking hits. Within our community here in town, meeting survivors who look like me, who could possibly be my sister or my cousin, who I've shared similar lived experiences with, and realizing that they're experiencing some of the most horrific atrocities that could even be imagined. That really set the fire in my heart to be involved and to continue advocating and to continue making sure we are sharing their stories, that we're helping to train people about what to be aware of.
Thank you. And yes, the ubiquity around this issue is really one of the things that can really sort of be something everybody should know about, really, who's on this call, no matter where you sit, no matter what you do. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to now introduce Melody Andrews, who is a rising 3L at the FSU College of Law. She also attended undergrad at Florida State. You were a double null and earned your bachelor's in theater and creative writing. She is dedicated to public interest and has been involved in the Children's Advocacy Clinic and the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Law Clinic, and has interned at the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence. And I'd like to ask you also, Melody, how is it that you're interested and involved in this issue of human trafficking, and what has kept you motivated to even be with us today and to do the work you've been doing in law school on this issue.
Thank you. So when I graduated undergrad in 2012, and I was in the workforce for several years, and I wanted to come back to law school in order to help people. So I participated in the Children's Advocacy Clinic at Florida State last fall. And from there, I spoke with Professor Annino and other people that have been involved in the clinic and learned about the Human Exploitation and Trafficking Law Project. And from there, that's how I got my start. Interacting with different survivors and learning has really been very impactful, and it keeps me motivated because I really like to see survivors, thrive after their trauma, and it's been a wonderful experience.
Great, thank you. And the fact that you have been so involved in this, I think no matter what you would do in the legal profession going forward, this is always going to be something I think that you'll find resonant with your work, no matter where your practice area is. And I'm mentioning that too, because we are getting CLE credits for this program today. And I know we have a lot of lawyers on, and I would challenge any lawyer, and I'm gonna next introduce Daniela, but really challenge any lawyer to give an area of law that human trafficking does not impact. Right. Okay. So now let me introduce Daniela Donoso, who is the Equal Justice Works Fellow. She is that position is sponsored by the Florida Bar Foundation and Greenberg and Traurig, and is hosted by the Legal Services of North Florida agency here in North Florida, and we love LSNF. Daniela designated her fellowship to be a comprehensive immigration advocacy program in North Florida to serve immigrants who are low income or crime victims and establish immigration protocols, procedures, and resources for LSNF staff and community partners. Daniela, a past DACA recipient, knows what it is like to have your life shifted by fear and uncertainty because of the broken immigration system. Her personal and professional experience working with marginalized communities has instilled an altruistic spirit that makes her uniquely suited for this fellowship. Donoso received her law degree from FSU College of Law and became a Florida Bar attorney in April 2021. Donoso received her bachelor's degree in international affairs and interdisciplinary social science from FSU. She spent her undergraduate and graduate time working for the Center for the Advancement of Human Rights, gaining mentors and experience in immigration and anti-trafficking advocacy. Daniela, I'm lucky enough to have met you when you were working for all those years with the Human Rights Center at FSU, and it's just lovely to see you as a practicing lawyer now. But can you just give us a heads up about what your thoughts are? Why has human trafficking been so resonant with you in your life and your career?
Yeah, thank you, Robin. I think for me, having worked at the Center for the Advancement of Human Rights as an undergraduate student, I really got to see firsthand the importance of wraparound services for survivors and working with other stakeholders like STAC. I really fell in love with the work. And as mentioned, I myself grew up undocumented, and I understand some of those vulnerabilities that our immigrant communities face. And I really just want to keep growing as an advocate and keep learning. So thanks for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome, Daniela. And we're really looking forward to hearing your presentation today as well. So now I'd like to introduce Brent Woody, who is the Executive Director and Lead Attorney for the Justice Restoration Center. Upon learning that legal services would be an emerging critical need in survivors' restorative journeys, Brent started the Justice Restoration Center, a nonprofit dedicated to providing pro bono, trauma-informed legal services and anti-trafficking advocacy on behalf of victims and survivors. Brent has played critical roles in survivor-centered legislation, including Florida's human trafficking victim expungement law. Y'all, he is the expert on this issue in our state and also one of the few in our nation. He and his wife, Pamela, advocates against trafficking, arrange safe prison releases, coordinating safe transportation, and restorative housing for previously trafficked inmates. Brent, like with the others, I'd love for you to give us some thoughts about why this issue, how you've been involved, and some of your personal journey on what brought you here today.
Thank you, Robin. First of all, I want to say I feel really at home. I graduated from USF, and then I graduated from FSU Law School. So it's usually around like a million Gators. So, and there may be a million Gators on in this meeting, but I don't know you. So I'm glad to be here. Wow. So when my wife and I first got involved in this movement, we had the blessing to get to know a couple of our survivor leaders here in the Tampa Bay area and become really close personal friends with them. And I think it was the sort of learning, not their stories, because what happened to them was not their whole stories. It was just a part of their whole story. And to be a part of that and to hear what happened and to experience that. And in the context of that, I start to identify legal needs. It was something that I couldn't turn away from and didn't want to turn away from. And so early on, I just started trying to figure out, so what can I do? I'm not an immigration lawyer, and a lot of folks coming forward were not foreign-born, trafficked individuals. So I just kind of stumbled along until really expungement was sort of the turning point, where so many then came forward with criminal record issues and that kind of thing. And so I am absolutely privileged to do this work. I would love that there was not the need for it. I can't imagine doing anything else. The most incredible, our clients are courageous and resilient, and I learn way more from them than I do good for them. So it's an absolute privilege to do the work.
Thank you, Brent. And I just echo those feelings and the gratitude that we have as well for the survivors that we're able to support, right, in their journey and to connect them with needed services. So thank you all. And thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. I think it provides a good framework for us moving forward, and also can provide that information for anybody who's listening to know that this might be this area of the law might be something that you would know about because of the work you do, might be one piece of the puzzle as you work with an individual. But I will tell you, knowing about this issue will help you no matter whether you're in the law or social services or a member of the faith community or a neighbor in a community. So thank you all for sharing. All right, let's get into the meat of our program now and talk a little bit about human trafficking. If I could ask to get the next slide there. So here's our 101 part extraordinarily collapsed. But this is kind of the basis of where we start on this law and really on what human trafficking is in the legal framework. So human trafficking is the recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or obtaining a person using force or fraud or coercion for commercial gain. And so for this, you really have to focus on a couple of key phrases. One is this issue of force or fraud or coercion. You don't need all those three. And if you look at the next levels of definition that I have here, is knowing that human trafficking is divided under the law into two separate areas: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Sex trafficking is defined as the exploitation of a person for commercial sex that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. So again, there's an or separating that. You don't need all three. And in fact, if you're under the age of 18, under both Florida and federal law, you don't even have to show force, fraud, or coercion, because children are not legally able to consent to sex. And so the law imputes to them that you do, in this instance, that you don't have to show this element of force or fraud or coercion. So note too that this Florida and federal law are directly parallel. The same treatment regarding children and commercial sex is here. Note too, in that definition above where it says for commercial gain, this doesn't necessarily mean there has to be an exchange of cash or money in any way. It could mean somebody has induced, for example, a child to commit a commercial sex act for food or for a place to stay, or for drugs, that could be the commercial gain, if you will, or the exchange that takes place. Examples include prostitution, pornography, sexual servitude, escort services, and also camming. And what that is being online, online services showing pictures of yourself, performing certain acts, etc. That's something that also is, as I understand it, since the pandemic, that and other online activity, especially regarding sex trafficking, has exploded. Also know that labor trafficking is another form of trafficking. Both are under the rubric of human trafficking. Labor trafficking refers to the exploitation of a person for labor or services, again, through force or fraud or coercion. It is only under Florida law, though, where you don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion for labor trafficking, just as is the case with sex trafficking. So know that those are kind of the basics in terms of the law on this. And also, I thought it might be helpful to just share a couple of other things on this issue of force or fraud or coercion. First of all, to know that the issue of coercion is one that is probably the most common that we see. If you look at the movie Taken, or you think about kidnapping, rarely is that the case where victims of human trafficking are snatched off the street or abducted. What you see more is a grooming process or an insinuation where the trafficker makes promises, where the trafficker gets to know that person so well that they can really push their buttons, if you will, in building trust with that individual. Elements of coercion also include things like threats or holding documents. It could be any kind of psychological abuse, threats to the person, or harm. It's the creation of a dependence on the trafficker. So that those examples are ones that I think everybody who's going to speak to this issue today can probably relate further. And also on the issue of fraud, what we see all the time are lies, broken promises. I'll make you a star. I'll give you a job. You'll move here. You'll be able to send money home. All those things that we know are outright lies that the traffickers put out there to be a benefactor or to really tell someone. And by the way, particularly in this time of COVID, when folks are even more vulnerable, those lies and promises become even more powerful, if you will, as people are indeed more vulnerable economically. This is how we're going to go into the areas of the law, and we're going to talk about trafficked youth, and that'll be a presentation by Melody and Danica. Daniela is going to talk to us about immigrants, and then Brent is going to talk about expungement issues. And right now we'll move into our very first PowerPoint presentation. All right, so let me turn it over to you, Danica and Melody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robin. As Robin mentioned, I will be presenting alongside of Melody. We are from the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Law Project from the FSU College of Law. Our project focuses on working with minor trafficking victims and survivors and recognizing and supporting at-risk youth. I'll pass it to Melody to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Danica. So at first, we'd like to just give a brief presentation overview and let everyone know that this presentation is going to discuss trauma and the needs of commercial sexual exploited children survivors. We're going to define safe houses and safe foster homes. We're going to review findings from the 2021 OPAGA STAC report, and we're going to identify some limitations of safe houses and safe foster homes. We'd also like to just give some terminology examples. These will be used quite often in our presentation. So we'll discuss the difference between dependency children and community children. We'll talk about CSEC, and when I say CSEC, that means commercial sexual exploitation of children. These are the children that have been survivors of sex trafficking. We'll also discuss safe houses and safe foster homes, as well as trauma therapy and trauma-informed advocacy. As Robin said, this is not a 101 presentation, but we do want to give some background on trauma because it's really important to understand, especially in the context of human trafficking, and understanding the purpose of safe houses. Trauma, according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, results from a physical, emotionally harmful, or life-threatening event that has lasting adverse effects on the person's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. There are a few different types of trauma. There's simple trauma versus complex trauma. Simple trauma is, for example, would be like a car accident. It's a one-time event that can have serious trauma on a person. Complex trauma is ongoing. So at the Public Interest Law Center at HELP, we've had clients that have been victimized by different clients over time for years. This can lead to re-traumatization when talking with investigators or anyone trying to get more information about the trafficking. Complex trauma includes, can lead to triggers that look like PTSD. So we'd like to take a moment to talk about the importance of trauma services, because the experience of being trafficked has lasting adverse effects on children, specifically with trauma. We should note that trauma can exist before, after, and during incidents of trafficking. Various experiences of abuse can have compounding effects. Manifestations of complex trauma have long-term effects, again, resembling post-traumatic stress disorder. With trauma-informed services are not provided to survivors, we know that there's a likelihood survivors will develop maladaptive coping mechanisms, such as substance abuse. So abuse of marijuana, alcohol, as coping mechanisms. Also, if children survivors do not receive trauma services, we will see survivors being trafficked as adults as well. Trauma can affect people in different ways. It can take longer time to build trust with clients that have been trafficked or experienced this level of trauma. Things can become more difficult, and it can, again, lead to being trafficked as adults if they were trafficked as children. SAMHSA's definition of trauma-focused therapy is a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed. It realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. Now we'd like to talk about two different types of children that are at risk for trafficking. The first is dependency children, and the second is community children. What distinguishes dependency children is that prior to the commercial exploitation of children, they were subjects of reports of abuse, abandonment, or neglect that resulted in the determination of dependent status. In other words, they became involved in the dependency system. Community children are children that have not had prior involvement with the dependency system. And with the commercial exploitation of children or trafficking is involved, both children groups have vulnerabilities that make them targets of traffickers. Both children groups need services following trafficking to prevent further traumatization or re-victimization. Both children groups are capable of resiliency when adequate services and interventions are provided. All survivors of CSEC in safe houses or safe foster homes receive a case manager and a case plan, even if they're not in the dependency system. Some of the vulnerabilities, just to mention, are homelessness and runaway status. And within community children, we've noticed clients that have been homeless in the past have ended up in trafficking situations. So that is a high risk factor. Now we can get into the law about safe foster homes versus safe houses. The law is Florida Statute 409.1678, and it provides specialized residential options for children. A safe foster home is a foster home certified by the department under this section to care for sexually exploited children, and a safe house is a group residential placement certified by the department. Safe houses and safe foster homes must provide a safe, separate, and therapeutic environment tailored to the needs of commercially sexually exploited children who have endured significant trauma. Part of this section of the statute says that they must use strength-based and trauma-informed care, and they must serve exclusively one sex, and they group child survivors by age or maturity level. So now we can discuss the purposes of safe houses. It protects and conceals the survivor, it provides intense trauma therapy and other types of counseling in a safe environment, and removes the survivor from the place where the trafficking and trauma occurred. Safe houses can provide safety, they can help survivors build trust with safe adults, help survivors regain personal power and move towards independence. HELP has participated in a podcast with the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence, and we've heard stories about safe houses giving survivors toiletries and towels when they get there to the safe house in order for the survivors to take a shower and kind of mentally wash away their past life in order to move forward. Now we can go and transition to more specifics with the law with Danica.
Thank you, Melody. Listed here on the slide, you'll find services that are required by Florida statute to be provided by safe houses and safe foster homes. These homes must either arrange, provide, or coordinate these services to their survivors. There's one service in particular that I'd like to highlight, which is the mentorship by survivors. We found in literature that mentorship by survivors has been found to be a promising practice, and field experts have reported that improved outcomes have been demonstrated when utilized with survivor children. One thing that's interesting to note, however, across the state of Florida, across safe houses and safe foster homes, only 4 providers in the entire state utilize the mentorship of survivors. And between those 4 providers, only 12 survivors share or serve as mentors. This is interesting and due in part to the fact that some of these survivors are ineligible to serve as mentors because of past criminal history. As Melody mentioned, one of the things that we have utilized in our research is the OPAGA report. OPAGA is the research arm of the Florida legislature, and it stands for the Office of Program Policy, Analysis, and Government Accountability. They released this report just last month, actually, and this report contains some information that is really insightful about the commercial exploitation of children in Florida. Now, one thing I want to recognize is that there are limitations to this report. We recognize that this report is only looking at a sampling of what we know is the larger child trafficking issue and crisis here in Florida. We recognize that the report was based off of children that have gone through that sort of gateway of going through the abuse hotline and being verified as a survivor of sex trafficking. So, as I mentioned, this is a sampling of what is in fact a much larger issue. In 2020, 383 children were verified as survivors of sex trafficking. Now, if you look at the screen, you'll see between the safe houses and safe foster homes, we have a combined total of 87 beds. Now, I might not be great at math, but if I looked at that 383 number of verified survivors, which we know there's much a much higher number of true survivors, compared to only 87 beds, you would find that less than 25% of survivors would be able to be placed in a bed. The fact of the matter is the fact that beds also remain empty. A lot of those placement decisions are based off of potential conflicts within the residential home with current children staying in the home, as well as the needs of that particular survivor. Ultimately, we also recognize that the decision to place a child in a home is left to the decision and the discretion of the provider. In the past year, in 2020, only 59 verified survivors of trafficking were placed. That leaves 291 children who were not placed in a safe foster home or a safe house. I want to recognize, however, that in some cases, these children are better suited for placement in facilities like a residential substance abuse treatment center or mental health treatment center. We also recognize that some of these survivors can be better assisted through the provision of wraparound services. That means that wraparound services are able to be provided to benefit them while they can stay in their own home. So I want to go through the process of how a determination for placement is made. I'm going to use some terminology on the slide that I'll break down. First, we know that a child must be identified as a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. At that point that that child is identified, a community-based care organization, or CBC, will determine what the appropriate placement is. In order to make that determination, a multidisciplinary team staffing meeting, or MDT staffing meeting, takes place. That MDT team includes investigators, supervisors, regional human trafficking coordinators, regional criminal justice coordinators, DJJ staff, service providers, law enforcement, guardian ad litem, as well as other parties. Advocates, if you have the opportunity, you should ask DCF to attend an MDT staffing as another party. We have done that for our cases, and we found that being able to be there at the table, we were able to help get services in place for our survivor clients. And with regard to dependency children, we recognize that GALs, guardian ad litems, should always be notified and attend MDTs. Now, with regard to the level of care placement tool, that tool examines and analyzes that individuals experience. They're going to look at runaway history, foster care history, current involvement with either a gang or trafficker, current substance abuse, behavioral and psychiatric history, positive support systems, and considerations of the location. They also want to look at the readiness for that child to receive services. Now, we recognize there are reasons given for non-placement of survivors. As I mentioned earlier, a higher level of care may be needed, whether that's through a substance abuse treatment center or mental health facility, or possibly even a DJJ commitment program. We also recognize that safe homes may frequently refuse youth who are actively engaged in recruitment activity. That's activity where they try to recruit other children to participate in a trafficking or exploitation scheme. We also recognize youth may be refused if they display histories of violence or have complex unmet needs. As mentioned earlier, there's also limitations for safe house placement when there's either a gang affiliation or a commonality of trafficker between the current residents of the home and the prospective resident. Ultimately, when a conflict of interest arises, that child will not be placed because the conflict of the needs and not wanting to put conflicting children in the same home placement. Next, I recognize that children may be on runaway status. According to the 2021 OPAGA report, 31% of children who were verified as trafficking survivors were then later found to be on runaway status at the time that they were evaluated for placement. Now, that runaway status doesn't prohibit them from being included and eventually being placed in a residential placement. However, it delays the provision of services. So here we've included some of the limitations of safe houses. As I mentioned, one of the things that we recognize with safe houses is the fact that there may be a delay in placement. There's a time between when the child is recognized, identified, and verified to when they are actually receiving a placement. That time can elapse between months, weeks, in some cases, even years, unfortunately. And that is very frustrating when you have a survivor client who is in need of services. Furthermore, we recognize the needs of transgender youth and non-binary youth. They truly need to be recognized, and additional training needs to be provided to service providers in making sure that they understand how working with survivors who are transgender or non-binary. We also recognize, due to COVID, there are limitations on safe house employee staffing and the availability, the number of employees who can be in the home, as well as the exclusion of survivors with children. We have found, working within the clinic, that a lot of our female clients have children of their own. And so when they come in to the system with a child, it is much harder for them to find a placement for them and their child. Next slide, please. So what can advocates do? One of the first things is to encourage foster families to get safe foster home certified. In order to become certified, foster families need only take an additional 24 hours of training, as well as satisfy more stringent home requirements. I'll say for myself personally, when I saw the need in our community for the foster care system, and I actually saw the children who were involved in the system, I recognized that there was a need for more foster parents and more people in the community to step up to be fosters. I've had the opportunity to go through training, and I'm glad to say that because of that, I can be a part of the solution to help stand in the gap in the meantime. We also want to see trauma therapy for at-risk children. As Melody mentioned, children who are on runaway status, chronic runaway children, or children who have been sexually abused in the past. These are children who we have identified as being at risk for human trafficking. And lastly, if you're a part of case plans, make sure that you're advocating for trauma therapy, whether that's through equine therapy or music therapy. These are therapies that have been found to help open the door and encouraging trafficking survivors to be safe and open. Thank you. Trauma-informed advocacy. So we've talked a lot about trauma. We recognize trauma does not just manifest in one way. Trauma may show up in a bunch of different ways, but it's important to recognize some of the initial signs. This is, of course, not an in-depth treatment of trauma-informed advocacy, but some of the things that you should be aware of. When dealing with survivors, you may recognize that there is a diminished trust in authority figures or professionals, as well as feelings of hopelessness and difficulty regulating emotions. As an advocate, you want to do your best to avoid re-traumatization. You want to understand the triggers and the things that really disturb your survivor client. Next, you want to empower your survivors by developing trust. Trust is a fluid thing. It takes a long time to build up, and it could be shattered in an instant. With a client that we had that lived in Ocala, we were actually able to help develop that trust simply by showing up to being a reliable person, a consistent person in their life. It came to the point where every time I came to visit, I made sure I brought food with me because that was something that she looked forward to and relied upon, and that helped us to establish trust. Next slide. We have listed here 2 opportunities for professional certification if you'd like more information. These are offered through the FSU College of Social Work. They're in trauma and resilience and human trafficking prevention and intervention. And I want to give a shout out to Robin because she was a major facet in the creation of that certification. Here is a glossary of the terms listed in our presentation. Next slide. And for your reference, we've included links to the Public Interest Law Center, the Florida statutes, the Paolo report, as well as CBC contact information. CBCs are organized regionally, and so we want to make sure you are able to get in contact with our community-based care organizations that are providing these services to survivors. Thank you so much for joining our presentation today, and I will pass it back to Robin.
Okay, now I'd like to ask Daniela, we're going to bring you up next.
Yeah, thank you to Danica and Melody. That was awesome. A lot of great information. And I don't want this to feel like disconnected. I know it's a totally different kind of subject matter, but we're going to be talking about immigration and human trafficking. And we can go to the next slide. So first, I just wanted to give an example because I know Brent is going to go into more of the expungement and things like that. And so an example of human trafficking of an immigrant survivor, this is from the Survivor Reentry Project, American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, from one of their trainings. So in a 2011 New York vacator case demonstrating intimate partner trafficking, a domestic violence victim's husband lured her from the Dominican Republic to the US by falsely promising that the abuse would cease and that he would help her obtain immigration status. When she arrived in the US, however, he physically abused her, imprisoned her against her will, and ultimately exerted control over her entire life. The victim's husband forced her to engage in illegal activities, including prostitution, and took all of her income to support his drug addiction. The court found that the victim's experience qualified her for vacator relief and vacated the criminal convictions on her record. Traffickers, we know, instill this kind of fear and exploit vulnerability in their victims while convincing them that they are lawbreakers and thus unable to go to the authorities for help or for protection. We can go to the next slide. So really just to set the kind of framework that foreign national victims face an additional risk within the criminal justice system because immigration status could be severely impacted by criminal legal involvement. Next slide. And so when we talk about the criminal legal system and non-citizens, when we think of crimes that meet the definition of a crime of moral turpitude, which I won't really get into depth today, but these present specific dangers to foreign-born survivors who previously adjusted or attempted to adjust their citizenship status. And non-citizens can also be denied initial or re-entry into the US if there are immigration officials or Border Patrol officials that have reason to suspect that they're entering for purposes of committing some form of crime, maybe prostitution, and it can be based off of any arrest or conviction records that they might have. And also these convictions can bar can also bar foreign national victims from a variety of forms of immigration relief, which we are going to very briefly go over today. Next slide. So again, this is not an exhaustive list whatsoever. Immigration is very complicated, but these are just some of the more common forms of immigration relief available to survivors. Next slide. So we're going to start with continued presence. And continued presence is allows otherwise undocumented survivors to remain in the United States as long as they continue to cooperate with law enforcement and provides some access to some benefits and employment authorization. So continued presence is temporary. It's not a lawful status in the US. It just allows those survivors to legally stay in the US, which might sound confusing, but continued presence has to be requested for a survivor by a law enforcement agent. And so advocates can work with that law enforcement agency that might be investigating the trafficking to apply for continued presence. And actually now Department of Homeland Security has a Center for Countering Human Trafficking and sort of this new continued presence program. So they'll work with advocates to assign a victim assistance specialist specifically to get this continued presence petition sent to immigration services. So advocates, typically there's affirmative applications, some of which we'll talk about today, but continued presence, you can request it as an advocate to the law enforcement agency, but sometimes it's totally out of your hands because it has to come from the agency that's investigating. It's up to them to send the request to USCIS, to US Immigration Services for that client. So, and these are issued for no more than 1 year increments. So, and with continued presence, typically, I guess, or best practices would be to apply for that as soon as an investigation begins of the trafficking, to allow your client to have that stability of a work permit while they're waiting, let's say, for their T visa to be adjudicated. So T visa, in order to receive a T visa, also known as a trafficking visa, the applicant must cooperate with any requests for assistance in the investigation or prosecution of any acts of trafficking. And the person must have been a victim of a severe form of trafficking, be physically present in the US on account of the trafficking, and be likely to suffer extreme hardship if they removed or deported. Something sort of similar, the U visa, and we can go to the next slide. So for U visas, a victim also must cooperate and be willing to cooperate in a criminal investigation. It's a requirement for the U visa. And so there's something called the supplemental B certification form. And this certification form is typically signed by the law enforcement agency that is investigating the case. So if there is a criminal case open, the advocate will want to ask that agency to sign the certification that basically says that the person was a victim of a crime, that explains the crime, and the crime must be one that's designated by the TVPA, must be a qualified crime in order to be qualified for a U visa. And so again, it is a requirement, but there is also, if there is no, let's say, police report, or there's no criminal law enforcement agency investigating the case, if you have a case of someone who's been a victim of domestic violence is a qualified crime for a U visa. And so you could ask a judge, a family court judge who has issued an injunction to sign the certification form as well. But it must have been a crime that violates domestic law, and it must have occurred while being in the US. And again, this is a very brief overview, but recipients of these forms of immigration relief are eligible for employment authorization and some benefits and services available to victims of trafficking. And something I didn't mention, so even now, recently, USCIS changed some rules, and luckily, survivors who have a pending U visa can, if they pass a bona fide determination review of their U visa case, then they may be eligible for employment authorization while they wait for an adjudication of their petition. So it used to be that you would have to wait without an employment authorization for your visa to be adjudicated and then get a work permit. And now this is a huge form of relief for those survivors who are kind of in limbo while they wait for adjudication, but can have some stability again with that work authorization. And again, the T and U visa provide that temporary lawful immigration status. And then you have the option of adjusting to permanent legal resident status. So there is that pathway to citizenship with both the T and the U visa. Next slide. And then again, just to reiterate, so when representing any non-citizens, it's critical to consult with an immigration attorney to ensure that the legal action that they're a part of won't cause any adverse consequences in subsequent immigration proceedings. And for clients who have not previously had immigration representation, also essential to contact an immigration attorney to see if there are any other forms of immigration relief which they may be eligible for. Because again, this was not exhaustive at all. I didn't have time to go into some of the other ones, but just wanted, again, to give a brief overview, different immigration relief that is out there for non-citizens, and that critical to consult with an immigration attorney about them. Thanks, Robin. I'll hand it back to you.
Daniela, great, thanks. And I think that point is one that I know I've seen how important that is time and time and time and time again. Even with one of the last questions we see in the chat, which is it better to get a U visa or a T visa? And while the T visa was created for trafficking victims, it might actually be better to get a U visa, right? Or it might be better to go under if, say, the victim is a victim of domestic violence. Maybe they should go under yet another immigration remedy, right? With what's available to victims of domestic violence. So it depends, right?
Absolutely. The best attorney answer, right? It depends.
It depends.
On each client. Yes, for sure.
If only on the bar that were always an answer, right? Answer D, it depends. We get them all right. Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Daniela. And now I'd like to queue up Brent for our next presentation. How's that?
Thank you, Robin. Looks good. You can actually just advance on to slide 4 if you have that capability. So the Justice Restoration Center is a nonprofit. Talked a little bit about that before. We provide no-cost legal services to human trafficking victims and survivors exclusively. And so that's just something that I have been doing full time since 2015. And as I said earlier, it's a privilege to be able to do this work. Today, I just kind of want to talk just a sort of a brief overview of criminal record expunction or expungement. We kind of use those terms interchangeably. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of it, a little bit about the process. And I will say, if this sounds like a super dry topic and technical and that sort of thing, it is in some respects. But I do want to say that when you have the opportunity to share the news with a survivor that her or his criminal record has been expunged, it's a pretty remarkable experience. And we'll talk a little bit about the results of criminal record expungement, but it's a super important area for many of you advocates who are familiar. You have clients who have criminal records. You know almost firsthand the effect of it. So human trafficking related legal issues, pretty intuitive here. Criminal records that come about as a result of being trafficked, which can be if it's a sex trafficking situation, you may have prostitution, other related sex crimes. If it's labor trafficking, and often those two overlap. We see a lot of labor trafficking within a sex trafficking scheme. You may have being forced to engage in illegal activities like stealing from Walmart and various drug-related activities. So you'll still end up with a criminal arrest record. We have coerced debt and debt bondage, family law issues. We coordinate out-of-state counsel. Always working with warrants and that sort of thing. Intellectual property rights, which I won't go into, but that's a thing too related to survivors. As Danielle mentioned, certainly immigration, the impact on immigration, and you can go to the next slide there. We do a good bit of trafficking related case management. So we talked about safe prison release, housing, coordinating trauma therapy. We're not trauma therapists, but we get our clients connected when needed, employment opportunities, and collaborate like crazy with other service providers, many of whom I noticed are in this meeting. Yeah, so then we work on Florida and Tennessee law in terms of legislative and policy advocacy, and we're working on some federal law as well, federal expungement and vacatur law. Next slide. So today, expungement of Florida criminal arrest records. Go ahead to the next slide there. The consequences of a criminal record. Danica touched on this earlier, and somebody asked this about this in the chat. Employment, and I'll just mention the dilemma that we have with our survivor mentor candidates. So often have a criminal arrest record, and we represent several of them in terms of trying to clear their records. Yes, their records can be cleared if their record was related to their trafficking. So it's a thorny issue. I feel like this needs to be dealt with. I'm just going on a sort of a sidebar here, but I think it needs to be dealt with to open up these opportunities to lived experience experts to serve as survivor mentors, even when they have criminal records that possibly are not eligible for expungement. So consequences of criminal record, employment, housing, education, volunteering, civic participations. If you're a convicted felon, you can't vote. Child custody issues, immigration issues. Go ahead to the next slide. And then the sort of less tangible, but no less important stigma, shame, and the low self-esteem that can come from that, being re-traumatized by just the memory of a criminal arrest record, the memory of being arrested, the trauma triggers related to that, family relationships where the family doesn't understand, why'd you choose to do this? Why do you have a criminal record? Why did you get arrested for prostitution? And just social relationships, friendships, and the like. Go ahead to the next slide. So one of the key factors here, and we talk about this a lot, is how the arrest create, increase, and perpetuate vulnerability. They actually make it more difficult for a survivor to engage in their restorative journey and to recover from what's happened to them, and to get a normal life, either get back to a normal life or get to a normal life for the first time. So we have got to stop looking at arrests as some sort of exit ramp from the life. It does sometimes get survivors, out of the life, but at great costs. And as we'll see, go ahead to the next slide. It actually can get them stuck in the cycle of being, arrested. So they exit the exploitation, maybe, go through some recovery processes, but they can't get a job, can't find housing. They don't really have meaningful choices. So they're vulnerable again for re-exploitation, re-arrest, and this cycle just continues. And so we have expunged as many as 50 cases from a client in one county, just because it was a revolving door. So arrest is not a great exit ramp from the life. So go ahead, next slide. Sorry. Section 943-0583 is Florida's human trafficking victim expunction law, passed in 2013, and we began to use it when it became enacted in 2014, filed our first successful expungement petition in 2014. It's an amazing law, and I'm just so glad I'm in Florida and we have such a good law, because we use it literally every day. And we've expunged probably over 800 charges now since that time. Next slide, go ahead. So just a quick overview of the process. We have to determine eligibility for our client's use of the law. So that involves making sure identifying them as a trafficking victim, which may have already occurred from a service provider or from law enforcement or whoever the referring agency is. But sometimes they just come to us directly. And so we'll determine, whether or not they were a trafficking victim, whether or not their charges that they need to expunge were related to their trafficking. We'll talk more in depth about that in September, kind of how that process is and what constitutes being related to their trafficking. So there's information gathering, which involves their gathering their criminal record, preparing the documents to be filed. So obviously, again, petitioner must have been a victim of human trafficking. The offenses that we're going to seek to expunge have to be eligible offenses. So there are some that we cannot expunge, which are the more violent murder, arson, robberies, and things like that are not eligible to expunge. And there has to be a nexus to the arrest or the conviction. And we've gone over this. This is elementary. I think persons subjected to coercion, this is from the statute as defined in 78706 for the purpose of being used in human trafficking, or a child under 18 years of age subjected to human trafficking, or an individual subjected to human trafficking as defined by federal law. that's not as easy an analysis as it may seem. And we will go into more depth in that in September as well. There are a lot of nuances to that. And it's, excuse me, it's really important, I think, for lawyers and non-lawyers, service providers, to have some understanding of what a person may be, what a survivor may be eligible for in terms of defining them as a trafficking victim. Go ahead to the next slide. And what does the petitioner, what does the survivor have to do in this process? I know that some states require a survivor to go to a hearing or to participate in the process in a really invasive way, and a way that has the potential to re-traumatize the survivor. In Florida, thankfully, we don't have those requirements. So the hardest part of this process for a survivor is to provide the information about what happened in their trafficking situation. And sometimes, in some cases, we don't need to get a lot of information. For example, if a survivor's trafficker was prosecuted in federal court, and our client participated in that investigation and prosecution and testified, that documentation in and of itself is going to be sufficient to file and to obtain the expungement. So we're not even going to have to delve into what happened to them. And of course, we prefer that, so that we're not somebody else asking them again to go through talk about their victimization. Anyway, they'll be helpful for gathering documents. In some situations, again, I keep plugging the September thing, but there may be a situation where they would need to interview with a prosecutor, and we have a process for that we can talk about. They will not have to go to court, and that is one of the key things that we're able to tell our clients. This is not going to involve you going to court. You will not be deposed. You're not going to have to go through a situation that is potentially going to be re-traumatizing. Go ahead, Robin, next slide. Certainly survivor concerns, which I touched on. How long is it going to take? And we don't ever know how long it's going to take. That does depend on what circuit we file in, and how fast the prosecutor, state attorney, or statewide folks respond. But normally we get it through in a couple of months, few months, sometimes faster. In some certain situations, we actually did one overnight. That's another story. But so there's not a real clear answer to that, but it won't take years typically anymore. So will I have to appear in court, testify? No. Is the information public? It is not supposed to be. We have to wrangle a little bit with our clerk's offices, who don't always keep it confidential. That's a tweak that we need to make to our expungement law to make sure that these petitions to expunge are confidential, because of the devastating information that's revealed in a typical sworn statement. What happens if we win? What happens if we lose? We'll navigate those. Go ahead to next slide. And again, once the petition's filed, we hurry up and wait. Sometimes the state will want more information, and the state ultimately will respond by either objecting to it, which is essentially never happens, or stipulating to it, which is what we prefer, or at least not objecting to the petition. If the state stipulates, or at least doesn't object, then we send a proposed order to the court, and the court generally signs it without a hearing. Next slide. So based on the final order, the clerk of court seals the court records, forwards the expungement order to the other agencies who have to comply with the statute, and they either expunge or seal their records. And go ahead to that next slide there. The petitioner is entitled to a refund because in Florida, under 943-0583, an expungement actually effects a vacatur of any related conviction. a substantive vacature, so a vacature on the merits. That's important for immigration purposes as well. But in this case, if they have paid fines related to the expunged criminal arrest record, they're entitled to a refund of those fines, and that's a U.S. Supreme Court law, U.S. Supreme Court case from 2017. So it's a very thorough, really incredible remedy. And importantly, a petitioner with a successful expungement may lawfully deny the arrest with two exceptions. One is if they're a defendant in a future criminal case, and the other is if they apply to a criminal justice agency for employment. And as I said, an expungement under that section vacates any underlying conviction. I can't overstate the importance of that vacature. Next slide, Robin. The effect, it eliminates fines, it eliminates probation, it eliminates a warrant. It could even eliminate incarceration related to a sentence from an expunged case. It also, if we expunge a felony record or felony records, and those are the only felonies on an individual's record, then their civil rights would be restored as a matter of law. They would no longer be a convicted felon. And reinstating driver's licenses. And I got a shout out to DMV, who work with us all the time on getting our clients' driver's licenses, reinstated. And so that's obviously critical for their restorative journey as they need to go to work, they need to take their kids to school, and the various reasons for needing a driver's license. Next slide. I already mentioned the fine refunds and the effects of vacating. Go ahead, next slide, Robin. Super important area here, the emotional piece, the non-practical piece of the effects of expungement, which we did not even think of when we filed our first expungement petition. The emotional side of things, the reputation, mitigating the effects of the trauma that might have been caused by the arrest, the criminal record, a sense of justice on the part of our survivor, even in cases where we haven't been able to expunge their entire record. Still, the part of their record that was related to their trafficking, there still is this sense of vindication and almost victory, something that has happened to them that's positive in the context of the system. I can't overstate how important that is for their just their emotional well-being, and how much that fuels them to keep moving forward in their journey. Go ahead, next slide, Robin. And then there are post-expungement concerns, which we could talk about for 2 hours by itself, just dealing with the residual issues. Even when we get everything off of the state databases and that sort of thing, and it doesn't show up in the FDLE report or the FBI report, they're still out there in commercial websites, right? Arrest.com, those sorts of things, news stories that we find years later that talk about our client. Agencies that don't remove the records. So, legitimate background agencies, but they don't update their records to show that to take our clients' information off. Warrants sometimes in other counties that didn't get picked up. And so we have to deal with those. Go ahead, next slide. And that's it. So that's a really fast, brief overview. There's lots of pieces to it. I find the pieces really interesting. Some of them are important in terms of their relationship with survivors and working with them and that sort of thing.
I'm incredibly grateful to all of you, Brent, Danica, Daniela, Melody. Brent, are there any questions here that you can address in terms of records? Connie asked if arrest and conviction records are checked. Does this check U.S. multiple country databases, counties, etc.? I mean, the records issue is huge, isn't it?
It is. And as far as I'm not aware of any international database for criminal arrest records. maybe there's one, and Danielle may know better in the immigration context, but I'm not aware of that. So typically what we're looking at are local, state records, and then the federal database, which would have other states. So that's the extent of that that I'm aware of. Somebody I know asked in the chat too about labor trafficking survivors and the ease of expunging. I hate to say ease of expunging because none of them are particularly easy, but there is a barrier there. And I want to put it this way. Labor trafficking is less understood, I think, by the system. And I'll just be very general in saying the system. And so it's a little more difficult to demonstrate where labor trafficking has occurred, especially if there's no ancillary case involving the client as a certified labor trafficking victim or identified labor trafficking victim. So it is a little bit tougher. We gladly take those cases and want to take those cases. And it's even a little more difficult if you're talking about child labor trafficking because Florida doesn't require coercion. So that's even more difficult to sometimes explain. And sex trafficking I think it's just easier for people to get their heads around. So, but legally, there's no difference. They're both entitled to the expunsion of their records.
Okay, great. Any other questions you'd like to highlight? I did see questions about that were answered about if no beds are available for children, what some of the responses are there. And any other questions? Danica, would you like to address one of the questions to your presentation?
Absolutely. We received a question that asked what proactive and prevention services are occurring upstream to assist at-risk community or dependency children. That's a huge question, but to take a small bite of that question, part of what is being done is increased efforts for education. There's a Florida mandated rule, the Child Trafficking Prevention and Education Rule, that requires age-appropriate trafficking education for all students of Florida public schools. So this is one of the first steps really in helping to inform children who could be at risk about the dangers and things to be aware of when it comes to sex trafficking in particular. In addition to that, we've also seen greater efforts and advocacy for training and education across professions. So that includes law enforcement, healthcare workers, and other forward-facing professions. We've seen that they now have a mandated required allotment of training hours that they need to complete specifically about human trafficking. And so while I recognize these efforts aren't necessarily a cure-all in helping and assisting and preventing, they are a step forward.
Well, and then the other thing I think we have to realize is that we live in a world where people are vulnerable, and whenever there's vulnerability, there will be traffickers trying to exploit people's vulnerabilities, period. So if you are working to find shelter for people who are homeless, jobs for people who just lost their job because of COVID, or when you're trying to find, like with any of us, clear an arrest record, each one of those is a step toward the next generation, as well as the person being helped to not be trafficked again. So the world of vulnerability is a place really that creates a world for traffickers to be in. Brent, I just asked you if you had any, it looks like you did answer that question now that I'm looking at it about C-sex survivors and the criminal barriers there. And everybody, we're just 1 minute over, so let me, gosh, as usual, we blinked and it happened. It was over. Thank you all so much. And I have to give a special thanks to Legal Services of North Florida. Again, I didn't say in particular, you are a co-sponsor. You did help us get the CLE credit that I just mentioned. Daniela, Colleen Mullins in your shop, and Leslie Powell-Boudreau, forever. Just great community partners. We love you and we thank you so much, Legal Services.